You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and today's conversation will focus on diversity. Why is it more important than ever for companies and boards? What does diversity really look like? What does it mean? And I'm so thrilled to have joining us today, Anna Mok. Anna serves as a partner at Deloitte, co-founder and president of Ascend, which is North America's membership network of Pan-Asian business professionals, and the co-founder of Ascend Pinnacle, which is a network of Pan-Asian corporate directors. We're also very fortunate at the Conference Board to have Anna as one of our trustees. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve, and your team for inviting me to join you today.
So, Anna, you've had just an incredible career. You know, we before we just jump into diversity, we've got to hear about your career. Tell us about it.
Well, Steve, I've had such a great privilege to build an amazing career at Deloitte, but also as it relates to my community work. I started as a CPA in our audit practice, and over the years have been a leader in different practices and leading major client relationships for the firm. I've had what I would consider a very unconventional career in that I've had a chance to meander, and in that meandering, it allowed me to really have a wide variety of leadership roles. So I've had a chance to start new businesses. I've been a leader in our marketplace, leading regions and growth initiatives. And I've actually had a chance to live and work overseas and work in a variety of industries. So it's been a really fun journey as it relates to my work.
Yeah, and you are the epitome of the term accountants rule.
I hope so, because I've been working with our state and national accounting societies, and we want to believe that it's such a great foundation.
Exactly right. Well, you're also an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, which is the mantra for CHROs and companies in the U.S. Talk a little bit about what DEI means and what each term means, and why is it so important today?
Yeah, it's interesting on this. It called me an expert in it. I don't think I started my career journey thinking I would be an expert in DEI, but clearly as a person that is an immigrant and with immigrant parents who have chosen a life in the US, this concept of DEI is front and center in my life. And so it's been great to do the work in this space. DEI is interpreted in so many different ways. And I'm not sure there's one definition for it, even though you can Google it and look it up. But the way I look at it, and I get asked this question often, and I'll break it down in what each of those words mean. To me, diversity means that we really recognize and celebrate that each of us are actually very different. You are very different than I, even though we both may have commonalities around our career or both are working, with the Conference Board, and we actually have unique voices. And that diversity actually real diversity leads us to really want to understand each other as fellow human beings.
Yes. So just take that term diversity, because it means something different, as you said, to different people. But what is it? Is it demographic? Is it attitudinal, psychographic? How do you think about it?
I think about it's all of the above, right? I think, what we've seen is sometimes we have this narrow lens of diversity, maybe just about race, maybe just about gender. It's actually all of the above, right? It's about my physical attributes. It's about my mental attributes. So it's really a very broad definition, which is why I said it, real diversity requires us to go deeper and you and I understanding, right, the essence of all of the aspects that make you Steve and make me Anna.
It is important to have people come from different viewpoints. I mean, you can deal with it from a racial standpoint, a gender standpoint,
Right.
da 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 da. But in a business environment, if everybody thought the same and thought, you wouldn't need the people, you wouldn't have the diversity of thought, innovation, and everything that dealt with the customers. And so, in order to be successful in business, you have to have diversity from every aspect in order to be successful, right?
Yes, right. We should reflect the marketplace, our customers, right? What the future looks like as it relates to our aspirations internally, so that there's this connection. I think that's what you're saying, Steve, right?
Yeah, and so with those companies that don't have diverse teams or diverse management, what do they give up? What do they lose?
Well, first and foremost is diversity of thought that you mentioned, right? If we all thought alike and we all looked alike or we all behaved alike, we get to groupthink. And there's plenty of research and study about the risk of that, right? We're not able to challenge each other and bring this other perspective, right? I have a different perspective than you, not because we're not both highly intelligent people, that we're not great business people, but I have different perspectives. And as an employer, the employer should want a perspective from you, should want a perspective of me, because we are different. And that difference actually brings and creates richer products. It creates a better understanding of our customers and a better, I would say, vision. It helps create better visions of what our business strategy should be moving forward.
Yeah, and anytime you generalize, of course, you're wrong. But
Right.
right, by definition. But when I look at the United States and what the country has accomplished in a very short period of time, the level of innovation and invention that has come out of the country has just been incredible. And in a private sector that's not directed. How do you think about DEI, diversity, and especially as it relates to that level of innovation and invention?
Well, I think it is the desire, right, to constantly be ahead, to break barriers, to disrupt, that has led to much of that innovation. So the question is then, how do you get there, right? And I think those same principles lead to then a desire to have DEI, right? And actually emphasizes the importance of that.
Right. So, so you could come at it from, gee, it's the right thing to do, right? Which is the way some people come at it. But you could also come at it and say, in order to drive success in your organization, in order to differentiate your company, in order to connect with your customers, in order to connect with all of your stakeholders, it is imperative that you have that diversity, that difference of thought, and action in a company in order to make it successful, right? Isn't that another way to think about it?
Most definitely. I mean, I find it ironic that people still today need to ask, why is diversity important? And I don't think it's actually a new thing to say it's important today. I think it's always been important, but I think what should make it more obvious is when you look at the workplace shifts, when you look at the demographics, it is no longer a nice to have. It's really an imperative.
So as you think about diversity, you talked about it in terms of race and gender. Now and you just mentioned generations. Are there certain forms? How would you prioritize, or is there a priority to any of that? In terms of what's the most important, or is it just all of it must be?
I know at times it seems daunting, right? Because the answer is all of it must be. I'm not sure you can prioritize one single dimension over another. And I'm confident that companies and employers can prioritize multiple, right? These are large institutions with a lot of smart people. I think we can do more than one thing. So we should not see it as, because I am going to look at generational differences or look at race, that comes at the expense of us doing less on the gender dimension. And I think we have to change that mindset. I think much of our mindset is, if I focus on the second thing, it's going to detract from this first thing, right? And this concept that doing one takes away from another.
I think that makes so much sense. And so then the question is how to get there. Is there a specific, what's the secret sauce? Is there a specific formula to this? And, people have been debating quotas, forever, but is there a certain composition? Is there in order to create a nuclear reaction, you have to have a certain amount of fissile material. You have to have the rods in there in a certain way. And, if you get everything right, then you get, you get this wonderful reaction. Is it kind of the same with diversity, or is there a lot of ways to come at this?
There's many different ways to come at this. And, through my Ascend work in particular, I've had a chance to talk to many companies, hundreds of companies, in particular, their C-suite, their CHROs, their CEOs, their board members on this topic. And there's no one right way. I think you have to look at the organization, right? We mentioned some of those dimensions, Steve, earlier around marketplace, customer base, your workforce, the nature of the business you're in. Yeah. But I would say, though, in spite of I saying not one way, I would say one thing that is most critical and important is the mindset and the commitment of the most senior leaders in an organization. That includes your board, the CEO, and the C-suite executives on this issue. Without that commitment, and I'm talking about authentic commitment, not just saying, diversity is good because, quote, I'm going to check that box, but that the mindset and the commitment about DEI is there and it permeates the organization, and it is of the same strategic importance as you would put a growth initiative, a new product that you're putting out in market. And I think that is one of the most critical success factors. Without that, then it's just, you're talking about fringe tactics, right? You're not talking about something that is really into the core and the culture of an organization.
Yeah, and there's so much discussion today about in the ESG space about stakeholder capitalism and so forth. But you cannot think of that separately from DEI efforts, because the stakeholders are so different. And if you're truly going to have stakeholder capitalism and be mindful and balance all of the stakeholders, customers, employees, owners, environment, community, suppliers, yada, 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 if you're going to balance and do all that, then naturally you have to have a diverse management team and board in order to truly engage in a proper way. Maybe you could just help make that connection.
Yeah, you've stated it very well, Steve. I think, yeah. But you have to make that connection, and it has to be very intentional. But I think we all know much of what we all do, and this through our, your research, my research around boards. It's all about networks, right? And networks are created based on trust, and because that's how humans interact, interface, and that's how we work. So it has to be quite intentional about how we expand our networks at all levels to then bring more diversity into the boardroom so that your board reflects those dimensions you just said. And that we do that into our executive ranks, and we do that into our workforce, right? And we are challenging ourselves of why we are not more reflective of the markets. And I'll use that word broadly.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So far, we've talked about why diversity is important for businesses and what their goals should be. Next, we'll talk about what lies ahead for corporate diversity in boards and in management. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our conference board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the conference board, and I'm joined today by Anna Mok. Anna, we were just talking before the break about the importance of diversity on boards. Pick up that thought, because this is a huge focus now. You see it in the regulatory area from the SEC. You see it, obviously from shareholders and activists. Tell us why this is important and what should boards be doing today?
Well, it's important because ultimately the boards of companies represent the shareholders and are the biggest influencer in the strategy of a company. So if we don't bring diverse thoughts into that boardroom, companies will not evolve and change and take full advantage, right, of what the markets will bring. So the composition of the board is critically important. And as all the data shows, right, boards are not as diverse as they need to be. And frankly, that is what my observation of that a few decades ago, working with different organizations, is what led me to want to do more work related to DEI. This discussion of quotas is a very complex one. I don't think anyone, I should take that back. I would say I don't personally believe the mindset of quotas is the right direction. But I would fully acknowledge that there has to be goals. There has to be an aspiration. As a person of color and as a female, I don't want to be chosen because someone's trying to meet a quota. I want to first and foremost come to the table and be chosen because of what I know I can contribute. So the concept of quotas and the belief that just because you set goals and have aspirations, that automatically means a quota. I think we have to change that mindset because there's a negativity about the concept of quotas.
Yeah, we did a study a couple of years ago at the conference board and, talked to our members about that. And the people who were least in favor of quotas were the people who would be affected by them.
Right.
And because, they didn't want to be sitting at the table because they were the quota person. They wanted to be there as a full partner. They didn't want a bifurcated board and, those were the quota people and here are the real board members. You cannot have that. So I really appreciate, your thought on quotas, but you've got to get to diversity in some way or another. Is there an ideal mix in a board, from a diversity standpoint that you think of, or how should boards come at that?
I think boards should come at it similar to what I said. You have to look at your customer base. You have to look at your employee base. So Ascend has done a lot of work on this, Steve, as you know. We recently launched something called 10 by 25. And on the surface, it sounds like a quota because that says that we would like Fortune 1000 companies to have at least 10% of their directors be of Asian descent by 2025. So on the surface, it sounds just like a quota, but we don't look at it as a quota. And this is why, right? The current stats would say only about 30% of Fortune 1000 companies, as an example, have an Asian corporate director. But when you look at the workplace demographics, when you look at customer base, when you look at buying power, that doesn't make sense. But it's hard to articulate, right? How do you get to that aspiration, more diversity, without setting something out there? So I think that is the nuance around what needs to be studied by each company and each board. I can't determine for a company, or I shouldn't be the one determining, nor should you, what great diversity looks like for any one company. The board itself needs to evaluate that honestly, but it has to look at all the dimensions, right? And look at it in a more robust way than perhaps historically we looked at board composition.
Yeah, and one dimension of diversity is gender. And a few years ago, there were a number of organizations and efforts on diversity on boards, and somehow it's centered on this 30% number, which always bothered me. So we at the conference board came up with an approach that said every other one, and it was meant to say, let's not attack the current existing boards. Let's not demonize them, but as directors retire, let's replace every other retiring director with a woman. And so therefore, if you carry the math forward, it would be you'd have half and half on the board eventually. But that was just as it related to gender, and obviously there are dimensions of race and other areas. But I think what your point is really important, and I think the way you've done it and come at it is critically important. You're not attacking companies, you're not embarrassing companies. You're working quietly in partnership. And so talk about that as an effective means of making change.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, right? Business is done while we have systems and processes. So much is based on trust, so much is based on networks, right? Just like board placements on board, many of board candidates get to the board through referrals. So we have to pragmatically recognize that, right? I want to pick up, Steve, on your comment about every other one. The only thing I would say, it depends on what is your starting point, right? One may argue that every other one is great because you started already with a board that had some diversity. But another argument may be, well, every other one, if I wasn't diverse to begin with at all, whether on the gender or other dimensions, that might take me too long to get there, right? So again, there's no rule, but I think each board has to look at what is that aspiration and in what timeline, and then how do you get there?
In the Fortune 500, we're nearly 30% women today, which is great progress, because as you know, just a few years ago it was down closer to 10, but it does get you there. In the Fortune 1000, it gets you there in just a few years if you do it this way. But
right, but Steve, on that front, you have to look at then women, right? Women of color, women who are LGBTQ. What does that look like? So you got to get to that next level.
Yeah. In
terms of what that looks like. So that's just a starting point, right? Around.
Well, and the same for men. So right. So that you need an overlay. So that's the
Correct.
gender piece of it, but then you need the overlay of the broader diverse sets, right? Yeah, exactly. Some of these studies that have come out have shown that diverse companies perform better. I've always been suspicious of that because it's I'm not sure it's a causal correlation, but it does seem that the best companies do have more diverse management teams and boards. And I wonder it's because they're the best companies, they also, have the best practices. How do you think about that?
Well, the research, one, I'm glad that there's now more research, right? That I think previously these were just speculations or hypotheses. And with this greater attention, there is more research. I have seen, back to again, you first and foremost have to believe, and that more diversity of thoughts and differing views is a good thing. If you don't believe that, then you're not a leader that really believes in that, right? You're not going to be able to drive that. So I think it goes hand in hand to your point, Steve. The best companies probably start with believing that. And because they believe that, then there's intentionality then on creating more diverse teams. And that intentionality of creating more diverse team builds on then the success, right, that you started with on that belief, if that makes sense. And then you then in turn are a more effective team. And that in turn then drives more profitability, better returns for your shareholders. So it starts with what is the premise, right? What is the culture and premise of those companies that are performing better?
Right. No, it's a great point. Let's fast forward a bit because we're in a country that going through a pretty rapid demographic shift, and diversity it has been the whole DEI thing over the past 30 years has been sort of focused on you've got the majority white population and then the minority populations in a very short period of time. Is possibly 10 years, but more likely 10, 15, 20 years within that period of time, when you and I are both retired, we are going to be a majority minority population. So, and I know that's not today's issue, but just thinking forward, how will companies be thinking about diversity in that world? Did things change at that point or not?
So first, I actually don't see it. It's not an issue, right? What a great opportunity. Doesn't that show that here in the US, we have this great opportunity now to harness so much diversity, right? And bring that into the workplace. I don't think the concepts of DEI and all the work we're doing goes away, even when we get to the majority minority population, right? Because there's that in the future, it doesn't get simpler, maybe, if we believe, right? More diversity creates a different complexity, right? We have a lot more, one of the things you didn't talk about, we have a lot more mixed race people in the workforce. So that actually, there's even more nuance if you look at what the workforce will look like looking ahead. So I believe this work we're doing will continue, right? It will continue to evolve and take different forms of what it means to create an inclusive workplace, even when we're at a majority minority population.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I asked the question specifically because I think people think, well, it's going to be accomplished, it's going to be done at some point. And I think what you're saying is it's going to constantly be something that, it's like tending coals in a fire. It's a constant deal here.
And remember, diversity, it wasn't just one dimension, right? Right. So it's beyond one dimension. It's not just about race, and the majority minority is just about race. Right? It's just looking at the race dimension. It's not looking at other dimensions.
Yeah, it's a great point. All right, last question. So the motto of this great nation is a pluribus unum, which is Latin for out of many one. It's an interesting. Tell me what does that mean to you? If you read the American history books and all of our social study books, it talks about America as the great melting pot. How do you think about that and the objectives of the country, our whole motto as it relates to DEI?
Yeah, I interpret that as this concept of being united. That is different than the concept of being the same. Right. And again, each of us will interpret what that means for us. So I believe that at an individual level, that means we want to be united as fellow humans, and that we should be actively looking at understanding what are our similarities. But that doesn't mean that I take away and disregard the richness of the fact that we are different. And so depending on your interpretation, right, of what that means, one can say we may never get there, because I'm not sure we should have an undifferentiated society, right? If that means that we are all going to be the same. But if the interpretation is that we are united as fellow humans and we come together around some common visions of what society and what a good and civil society should look like, and I hope we will get there, right? as you said, we don't, well, sometimes because we may have different interpretations of that, at least a friction, in fact.
Anna, that was so well stated, and I just couldn't agree with you more. Anna, thanks so much for joining us today.
And thank you, Steve. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and have us really explore these very important topics of society today.
That's great. And thanks to all of you for listening to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a prominent thought leader like Anna to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in economics, public policy, ESG, diversity, human capital, and more. Please share CEO insights with your colleagues, with your children, with your friends, with your grandchildren. I know they're going to want to listen. Well, maybe not your grandchildren. Anyway, I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.